You just came back from a job interview. They called you back and they offered you the job. You proceeded to discuss salary. You were thinking of some number, not something you think was unreasonable, and they came back with a number that was significantly lower. You obviously feel lowballed, so you're thinking, what the heck happened? Why did they throw out that number? And how the heck do these companies get to those salaries that they offer? I'm Mike. I've got 25 years background in business from pharma, tech, and consulting. I've held C-level roles in international companies. I have degrees in businesses, human resources, and psychology. On this channel, I cover business and careers. I analyze and pick apart why companies do the things they do. And I provide advice on careers and navigating the corporate world. Today, the focus is on salaries, how companies manage them and set salaries. And also why it feels like they're lowballing you so often. And most importantly, what it means for you and how you can use this knowledge to negotiate your next salary. Let's get stuck in. We're going to start with, let's call it the best practice or the pro way to setting salaries. Not all companies do this exactly this way, but I would say that any company that has more than 1,000 employees is likely to have something like this approach in place. I'll cover smaller companies later in the video as well. The first thing you need to know is the names of a couple of companies. Radford, Willis Towers Watson, Korn Ferry, Mercer. There are others, but these companies do one important thing. They gather data on salaries across the world directly from corporations, and they sell that data back to those same corporations. The way it specifically works is a company goes to Mercer or some similar company and makes a deal to supply their own data in exchange for Mercer's full data set for the data that's relevant for the company. So if I'm working for Apple, I'll go to Mercer or whoever and I'll ask for benchmark data on tech salaries in the US and in all markets where Apple has employees. The exchange that happens is I give all the data I have, and what I do is I categorize all my data according to Mercer's data model. Mercer has thousands of positions and titles with detailed descriptions of every position, and I match all my jobs to these codes down to the last employee, and I hand over everything: base salary, equity, bonus, overtime, car allowances, health insurance, benefits, everything. Once I've handed that data over, I get that exact same data set back from Mercer or the other company, but with all the data from other companies as well. I can't look up a specific competitor, so I can't look up Google and see exactly what they're paying. But I get an overview of every single tech role in the Bay Area, and I can look up what the salary range is for an entry-level software engineer. The lowest, the highest, the median, the mean, how many observations there are, the salary drift from one year to the next. I can get geographically segmented data. I can look at specific sectors. I have essentially everything. The reality is, though, that these data sets are super slow and cumbersome to work with. It's a pain to constantly have to look up a very specific role in a specific area at a specific level every single time somebody's getting hired. It's also hard to navigate in for an employee. So what most companies do is they build a career framework. You know them. At Microsoft, you'll recognize this as a number, so 58, 59, 60, and so on. You'll also recognize it as a generic role like SDE or principal SDE. At Amazon, it's called an L3 or an L4 or an L5, with some other similar but not completely identical titles. The companies do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, they want their employees to have a clear understanding of what their career path is, what is expected of them at different levels, and what it takes to get to a different path or to a different level. Secondly, they bundle a lot of jobs into similar buckets to make those things more manageable. You do lose a little bit of precision, but you win in terms of accessibility. Instead of having a benchmark for 7 different kinds of entry-level software engineers, depending on which specific technology they're proficient in, all the stacks or all the techs are bundled into one bucket. It's always just a company decision of how granular they want these job categories. You could have a separate bucket for procurement people, or you can choose to have one big bucket for all staff functions, so procurement, HR, finance, facilities. There are strengths and weaknesses to the different approaches, but all in all, it's not really that important in the day-to-day. Next up, leveling. Leveling is what it says on the tin. You are in the procurement bucket. From there, the company throws people into different levels. Junior procurement analysts, graduate procurement analysts, they get put into level 3. Strategic buyers go into level 5, and strategic sourcing specialists go into level 6, and so on. Everybody gets put into a job bucket and a level. This is an exercise the manager does and then reports back to HR, and HR just consolidates the information. And this is where we get back to the original benchmark, because the company can now aggregate their salary data against an aggregated benchmark data set. And they can now see for all the roles at a given level what the low, the mid, and the high is for their own employees, and they compare that to the benchmark data sets and their low and mid and high. So far, everything is just data-based. It's a pure practical exercise in grouping, categorizing, and labeling salary data so you have usable, comparable data. What happens from there is entirely a business and a management decision, and it's about defining what the actual pay ranges for the company will be. Let's take an example. A company can see that they in general pay 10% above the midpoint compared to the market for most positions. The company can see that its best people are likely the highest paid people in the entire benchmark, and their lowest paid people are only, let's say, 10% below the midpoint. That's not often that happens, but some companies do actually end up and want to be leaders on salary. The key decision for management made from here is, where do we want to be? Do we want to stay in whatever range we're in? Do we want to move up or down relative to the market? If we're low compared to the market, do we care that we're low, or do we over time want to close the gap to the midpoint or the top end? So basically, a company makes a management decision to decide that they on average want to be 5% above midpoint with a spread of 25% below and 25% above. They can also choose to be exactly at midpoint and be 10% below and 10% above. Some companies are going to be of the opinion that they need to pay absolute top dollar for the best staff. Other companies will be of the opinion that they are so attractive to work for that they don't need to be market leading in terms of salaries. They believe that whatever value proposition they have will attract the kind of talent they need at the compensation levels that they offer. At the end of the day, they end up with some relatively broad salary ranges for every grouping and every level that they have. More often than not, those ranges have an overlap to the ranges above and below, and generally speaking, they're often quite wide, as in they are easily up to 30% to the left or right of any given decided midpoint. All this data has a lot of important uses. It's important for hiring, it's important for promotion, it's important for salary review. At salary review, companies can get super granular. Some companies don't allow for any management leeway, and salaries are entirely set based on a person's rating and position within the band. If you're a low performer, you're getting X%. If you're a high performer that's low in the band, you're getting a bigger percentage point than most. If you're a high performer that's high in band, then hopefully you're getting promoted, because the closer you get to the high end of the band, the more likely the stricter companies are going to start to slow down your salary increases so you don't break outside of the band. If you're below band for some reason, they might give you a special bump to bring you into the band if they have the money, of course. Generally though, the bands are built in such a way that they are broad enough for a person to progress through the band over time, starting at the low end, and then over time, depending on performance evaluations, ending up at the high end prior to a promotion event. At promotion, you've probably worked it out, you're probably going to be bumped into the low end of the next band above. If you were low in the previous band, you would likely feel a bigger bump when promoted than those that were high in the old band. Most companies tend to aim to level people out to some extent when they get promoted. There's not going to be perfect parity, but generally you can expect to reset together with other promoted colleagues at more or less the same area of the band. Now for hiring, it's the same general idea. If a company is looking for a level 6 something or other, the salary band for a level 6 is going to be the range the manager has to work with. Well, almost anyway, but I'll get back to that. First though, let's cover what the companies that don't have these benchmarks do. What do exactly they do? These benchmarks I've been talking about cost a lot of money. Those benchmarks usually require employees to maintain them, and sometimes you're in a market or industry where there aren't good benchmarks. Consulting firms actually don't usually have good benchmarks because a lot of the consulting firms don't hand over their data. These kinds of companies have a more limited and imprecise way of getting salaries. Sometimes these companies just look at what they're paying people right now. If they've got a call center employee on payroll, that's likely the starting point for what they think is a reasonable salary for the next call center employee. These companies may have a CEO or a hiring manager that knows a guy who once had a job at another company. That's also going to be a place where they get a ballpark to work with for salary. They might also have read something online about what things cost. In some rare cases, they might have access to some governmental type of salary statistic that isn't nearly as granular or precise as the commercial benchmarks, but it'll give them an idea of where to start. But in simple terms, these companies are setting salaries on equal parts of not having a clue, hearsay, and internal comparison, which brings us to the problems that lead to lowballing. If you're still here, then you're likely enjoying this video. If so, then click the subscribe button. It tells me I'm making content that resonates with you, and it's hugely appreciated. Thanks a ton. Why do you feel you get lowballed? First up, you might feel that you're being lowballed because the salary you're asking is outside of the range that the company has set for these positions. They want to be at plus minus 10% around the midpoint, and you've suggested 20% above the midpoint. They've just decided that the people with your experience and skill set are not something they want to pay 20% above midpoint for. Second, you're within their salary band, but all of their current employees in the team are at a lower salary. This happens more often than you think. A company is open to hiring people within a broad range, but because of historical salary movements, the team that you're joining has a lot of people that have the same experience as you, but are being paid less. There's no HR policy forbidding the hiring manager to hire you, but that hiring manager is thinking, what kind of a hassle am I creating for myself by hiring a comparable employee for 20% premium of my current staff? I'm sure you've maybe experienced this yourself. You making X and suddenly you have a new colleague with the same experience as you, and that person is making 20% more than you. Your frustration is going to lead you to complaining to your boss, and that's a hassle your manager would likely have liked to avoid. Third, you could possibly be benchmarked incorrectly. This isn't an exact science, and in some instances, the company has decided that this is an L4 role that they want to fill, but your experience and background makes you an L5. Basically, you're not high in band, you're in a totally different band. Fourth, you're coming from an industry or a company that just pays different. The most extreme example I can come up with is, imagine going from fintech to a governmental job. Odds are the government role is going to pay less for the exact same skills and experiences. Coming from banking and moving to retail is going to mean you're blowing those bands out of the water. A software engineer job does not pay the same in every single industry. Some industries are more profitable or more dependent on certain skills, so the companies will be willing to pay more, where others won't be. Lower margin industries often aren't going to be high paying industries. If you're coming from McKinsey and you're moving to telco, you're likely way outside of any band that makes sense. Going to a startup or a scale-up from a corporate job is almost always going to mean a salary and possibly a benefits cut at low and mid-level roles. Fifth, the person that had the job before you was being paid a certain amount and they only have the budget for that exact same salary. The band here isn't the issue at all, it's the finances. The bands are super broad, but you can only pay precisely X. This is going to be to your advantage if the person before you was 53 years old and had been doing the job for 20, 30 years and you're 28 years old. But if you're a 33-year-old and the previous person was 27, the odds are they're getting paid less because they have less experience, which means they've progressed less within the bands. So this won't be a benchmarking issue, it's a budget issue. And at the end of the day, the manager is likely accountable to finance for the budget and not much else. And blowing the budget by hiring more and more expensive people is just going to get them burned. Sixth is negotiation. Believe it or not all countries and cultures expect salaries to be negotiated. In the US, it's more or less customary to negotiate a salary. As a result, lowballing, at least to me, seems to be much more common. If you are, in inverted commas, stupid enough to say yes, that's on you and your negotiation skills. In the Nordics, they'll offer you something within the band, within the budget, and near something they find fair compared to what the rest of the team is making. Depending on the culture, there will be more or less leeway in terms of salary negotiation. If you're in a country where negotiation is very customary, lowballing is going to be more common. Regardless of all of this, I often see a strong antipathy towards companies and an anger for being lowballed. Some companies are predatory. There's no denying that. There are companies that would like to pay you as little as possible for as much work as possible. But honestly, most companies are just trying to find talented people and trying to control their costs while making database decisions. It's not personal for most companies or managers, and it's not personal for the hiring manager or the recruiter either. So number one, don't take it personally. Those reasons I've talked through are the constraints we're working with. Do you think the bands are too low? Fine, don't say yes to the job. Think it's weird that the manager wants to avoid conflict in the team? Fine, don't say yes to the job. At the end of the day, the only person lowballing someone is you if you say yes. At Deloitte, we had a really hard time attracting people to our strategy practice simply because we could not compete on salary with McKinsey, Bain, and Boston. Apart from that, I seldom experience candidates being outside of the band. This is important because the fact is, then you're in a situation where all you need to do is convince the manager. The band is not hindering the manager from hiring you. You need to give the hiring manager a reason to say yes to you. So let's run through how you can use this information to your advantage. There are 4 main strategies: switching levels, leveraging experience, leveraging industry, and leveraging hot skills. When switching jobs, it can always be relevant to argue that you are switching levels. If you're a recent graduate and you're starting in an entry-level job, well, then they're offering you an entry-level salary at the low end of the entry band. Most large companies tend to have almost standardized starting points for these types of roles with little room for real negotiation. When Deloitte brings in 200 graduates on the first of the month, those graduates are very likely all making the same, and the Deloitte graduates are making less than the 200 McKinsey graduates. Some cultures like the US do expect you to negotiate, where European companies are more likely to set a take it or leave it offer. But the fact is, the salary offered is likely the salary you can get when it's an entry-level role. But for all other levels, start with asking yourself the following question: where do you think you are in the band in your current company? Not in terms of your actual salary, but in terms of your seniority. So you started as a graduate 1 year ago at PwC. That means you should be up for promotion really, really soon. What would you likely get if you stayed and got promoted? 15%, 20% bump? Well, if you're switching to another company, you should be arguing that you shouldn't be seen as an entry-level hire, but as a person with experience, and you're not going to let go of your imminent promotion bump because of switching jobs. You should be arguing for that salary bump when switching as well, and it should work because you're not asking them to pay you outside of band. You're negotiating to be seen in a specific, different band. You can use your age and, more importantly, your experience to your advantage in a negotiation. Age is a proxy for experience often. Consider the situation where you're potentially asking for more than what the rest of the team makes. What makes you different? You've potentially talked about the team you'll be joining during the interviews. So you might have an idea of whether you're coming in as a more senior contributor or as a junior in the team. Give the hiring manager a reason to say yes to you if you have that seniority that justifies a higher salary. You can argue that even though you don't know what the rest of the team makes, you believe that your experience will entirely justify any premium you're being paid. And remember, those bands are likely quite wide, so giving a 20 to 30% range likely is not going to break you through those bands. Industry equates skill. I've seen this with consultants a lot. A lot of Boston consultants risk taking a pay cut when leaving consulting if they leave at the wrong point. They are so ahead in terms of earnings that a lot of companies just can't and don't want to compete. But some management consultants do succeed, and you can learn from them. The arguments they use is that they are bringing in experience that has come from an accelerated learning curve. Consultants and other people that come from high-paying industries make the argument, often successfully, that they need to be either at the high end of the band or in a higher band. If you're moving from banking to consumer goods, the experience you have is one that you should argue should be compensated for, and the accelerated learning curve you've been through and experience you've acquired is something you should be compensated for. On occasion, a very specific thing happens. You have a high-paying specialist expertise and you've been benchmarked against general skills. This happens a lot in tech. Everybody sort of assumes that everybody in tech is being paid a lot. It's just not the case. It's very specific skills that are being paid more. If you know that you're bringing in a specific hot skill, you need to ask the question what benchmark they're using. You shouldn't be expecting to actually get the numbers, but you need to make the case that you have a feeling that their offer maybe accurately reflects general skills within your field of expertise, but fails to capture the premium that your specific hot skill commands. In my 25 years, I've seen this argument work for management consultants, for SAP consultants, for data scientists, for GDPR legal specialists, and right now for different types of cybersecurity specialists. Companies know what's hot and they will adjust when they have to. Finally, negotiate. There's nothing wrong with negotiating. Is it uncomfortable? Yes, for some people it is. I don't particularly enjoy it either, but at the end of the day, it's basically about trying your luck and being willing to walk away if you aren't satisfied with the offer. Which leads me to the final piece, which is a little bit of bonus content. What should your range that you're throwing out there be? Now, the ranges that the companies have are typically relatively wide. You can also allow for a wide range in your personal band for the same reason. First of all, make up your mind what your minimum is. If you're in a job and you're reasonably happy there, there's no reason to take a pay cut. If you're unemployed, the cards you hold are obviously not the same. But honestly, if you were paid X 6 months ago, it's not unreasonable to assume that you can get ballpark the same in the same industry again. I can't and won't tell you to always set your minimum to 10 or 20 or 30% above your current base pay. I'm not going to know whether you're already being paid well for what you do or whether you're underpaid. But generally, there's no reason to go below what you're at right now. The higher you paid, the more likely you're stretching those bands already. But more often than not, in a desk job or a knowledge-intensive job, throwing out 10% on your current salary is likely completely unproblematic as a starting point, especially if you don't throw it out as a non-negotiable. The phrase, "it all depends on the total package, the role, and the challenges that you're offering," gives you leeway to move if you decide you want to. People are so afraid to throw out a too high number in fear that they'll be rejected. And the reality is, if the manager likes you, they'll go a long way to try and make it work. Plus, psychologically, a lot of people want to be accepted, so they lowball themselves. They don't want to be rejected because they throw out too high a number. But that's backwards. If you're in a good job, set a minimum that you actually have as a minimum. Now, as for the range, those bands that the company have are at least 15 to 20% to the left and right of some imaginary midpoint. That's a range of 30 to 40%. The bands are rarely the problem. If you take your current salary, add 10% as your minimum, and tack on a range of 25%, the top 5-10% might be outside of the band, but there's likely going to be a huge overlap. The biggest mistake I see people make is lowballing themselves. They either suggest or accept a salary which is below what they really want. Some people do have unrealistic expectations, and I've almost never seen in my career someone jump 50% from one job to the next, barring, an extremely small number of outliers. But the people that do the best are the ones that don't throw out a low number from the start. They have a range, they're realistic, they're pragmatic, they're flexible, and they make the conversation about more than salary as a negotiating tactic. They're good at giving a manager a reason to say yes, and they are willing to walk away from an offer they don't like. What are your experiences with negotiating salaries? Share in the comments with everybody else. Let's have a conversation about it. Remember to subscribe. See you soon.